My name is Elena Marlowe, and I've dedicated my life to uncovering forgotten folklore and buried truths. Legends have always fascinated me, especially those spoken in hushed tones, the ones the world pretends to forget. That obsession is what led me to Eldermore, a remote village shrouded in mist, hidden away in the dense northern woods, barely a dot on any modern map. The air here smells of damp earth and secrets. The trees loom like silent sentinels, and the wind carries voices that don't belong. From the moment I arrived, I knew something was off. The villagers, cloaked in wool and suspicion, watched me with wary eyes. They spoke little, offering only the necessities: a room at the old inn, cold bread, and the same warning whispered through clenched teeth: "Stay away from the well." At first I thought it was just superstition. Every village has its boogeyman, its bedtime tale meant to scare children. But in Eldermore, it wasn't just the elderly who whispered the warning. It was everyone. Even the children averted their gaze when I asked questions. That's when I knew the legend was more than just a story. As a historian, I've seen enough to know that beneath every myth lies a sliver of truth. So I dug deeper, asking quiet questions in the tavern, pretending to be a harmless outsider jotting notes for a book. One night, an old man, face lined like cracked stone, leaned in close after a few too many swigs of whatever passed for whiskey in this place. He spoke slowly, eyes darting toward the window as if expecting something to be listening. He told me of the well, a relic from a time when dark things walked freely and men offered blood to keep them fed. According to him, the well wasn't just old, it was sealed, hidden deep in the woods for good reason. "It calls," he muttered, before falling into a drunken stupor. "And when you listen, you let it out." I couldn't sleep that night. My dreams were filled with fog and echoing whispers. The next morning, I visited the dusty little archive attached to the village chapel. It was barely more than a cupboard filled with decaying tomes, brittle scrolls, and worm-eaten manuscripts. But nestled between pages of local family trees and farming ledgers was something odd: an entry in a crumbling field journal. It spoke of a sealed evil beneath stone and referenced old rites meant to imprison something. The author never named it, only drew a crude sketch of a stone ring encircled by twisted symbols. My pulse quickened as I traced the shape with my finger. The style matched nothing from any known ancient religion or folklore I've studied. It was older, darker. I flipped through the rest of the journal and found what I was hoping for: a map. Rough, hand-drawn, and faded, but legible. It showed Eldermore as it once was, and near the edge, beyond the tree line, was a spot marked with a faint red X. No road, no path, just forest. But something about that X felt like a challenge, or a dare. I returned to the inn, unfolded a modern map, and aligned the old parchment beside it. I cross-referenced landmarks, tree lines, even a long-dried creek bed that still left a scar in the land. I drew the route in pencil, tracing the path to what could only be the well's location. My heart pounded as I marked the spot, hands trembling with excitement and something I refused to call fear. I closed the notebook, folded the map, and stared out the window. The woods beyond Eldermore swayed gently in the wind like they were beckoning. I whispered aloud to no one, "Tomorrow, I find the well." And in the silence that followed, I thought I heard something whisper back. I woke before dawn the next morning, heart racing like I dreamt of something urgent, but couldn't remember what. The old map from the village archive still lay open on my desk, the red X staring back at me like a warning disguised as an invitation. I packed my field gear, slung my camera bag over my shoulder, and stepped out into the cold mist. The village was still asleep, roofs wet with dew, chimneys dark and still. No one saw me slip into the woods. No one stopped me. The deeper I walked into the forest, the more the world around me seemed to shift. The birds fell silent. Even the breeze that had carried the morning chill died off completely, replaced by a heavy, stifling stillness. The path wasn't really a path, just hints of one. Fallen branches, moss-choked stones, and occasional signs of something man-made long ago, now overtaken by nature. After nearly an hour of navigating through the thickets, I saw it. There, hidden behind a curtain of gnarled vines and dense underbrush, stood the well. It was ancient, older than anything I had imagined. The stonework was rough and uneven, covered in layers of moss and dirt. But what made my breath catch were the markings. Symbols carved deep into the stones, barely visible through the grime, yet unmistakably intentional. I recognized none of them from the archives, but some resembled ancient warding runes I'd seen in obscure European texts. Symbols used to trap, bind, or seal things that should never be freed. I approached slowly, as though expecting it to wake. The air around it was unnaturally cold, dense enough that my breath hung visibly, even though it was midsummer. My camera's lens fogged instantly when I raised it to take pictures. I wiped it and began photographing every angle: the symbols, the rim, the strange discoloration of the stone that looked almost like dried blood but too dark, too old. I set down my gear and began sketching. But no matter how focused I tried to remain, the feeling of being watched was suffocating. I paused more than once, scanning the woods behind me, convinced someone, or something, was nearby. When I dropped a small flashlight, the clatter echoed unnaturally loud, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I called out, "Hello?" No answer. Not even birdsong. I forced myself to stay. This was what I came for. I collected samples of moss from the stones, documented the angles of the runes, and ran my fingers lightly across the carvings. The texture was oddly smooth in places, worn not by weather, but as if touched by countless hands. Hands that had once prayed, or begged, or bled. Hours passed. I hadn't realized how much time I lost until the sky began to dim. I packed my things quickly, casting one last glance at the well. For a moment, I thought I saw something shift in its shadows, a flicker of movement just past the lip of the well's mouth. I froze, heart thudding. But when I stepped closer, there was nothing. Only silence. Only darkness. Back in my room at the inn, I uploaded the footage to my laptop. I played the videos one by one, eyes glued to the screen, scanning for anything strange. And then, in the footage from earlier that day, just as I stepped away from the well to photograph the carvings, I heard it. Faint, distant, layered under the rustling of leaves and the crunch of my boots. A whisper. "Go back." I rewound and played it again. Louder this time. Slower. "Go. Back." I stared at the screen, chilled to my bones. No one had been in the woods. I was sure of it. But that voice, low, hushed, and completely human, sounded like it had come from inside the well. I closed my laptop, sat on the edge of the bed, and tried to calm the sudden, suffocating anxiety clawing at my chest. Maybe it was interference, audio artifacts. Maybe I was just tired. But as I pulled my blanket tighter and shut off the light, I realized I could still hear it faintly. Not from the video, from the woods. A voice, just barely louder than the wind, calling out from where I had just come. "Go back." Something shifted in me after hearing that whisper on the footage. I played it over and over, convinced I was imagining things, but each time, the words grew clearer. Go back. It wasn't an echo, wasn't distortion. It was deliberate, and it wasn't just in the recording. The following night, long after the village had gone to sleep and the fog had rolled thick across the hills, I heard it again, faint, from the direction of the woods. That same voice, now even softer, as though it were waiting for me to come closer. I told myself it was stress. I hadn't slept well in days, and I was likely projecting. That's what I told myself. But I didn't believe it. The next morning, I returned to the well. I didn't even wait for breakfast. Something about it pulled at me now, like an itch beneath the skin I couldn't scratch. The woods were darker than before, the trees closer together, the trail harder to follow, even though I'd just been there. When I reached the clearing, I stood for a long time without moving. The well didn't look any different, but the air was thicker, heavier, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I walked to the edge and stared down into the darkness. No wind, no sound, just a pit that seemed to swallow light and time alike. That's when I decided to lower a recording device inside. I wanted proof, something I could play back, analyze, and maybe explain away. I fastened my digital recorder to a length of rope, switched it on, and lowered it slowly into the abyss. I waited, every second stretching like hours, until the device was almost at the bottom. At least, I thought it was. The rope stopped unspooling, but I never heard it hit anything. I left it overnight, praying it wouldn't get damaged. That night, I dreamt of voices, not just one, but many. Some whispered, others screamed. I saw shadows circling my bed, hands brushing the edges of my sheets, fingernails scraping lightly against the floor. I woke gasping, drenched in sweat, and swore I heard footsteps retreating down the hall. At dawn, I retrieved the recorder and played it back immediately. At first, it was just static and faint environmental noise, drips of water, occasional creaks of shifting stone. But then, just past the 4-minute mark, the static dipped, and something spoke. "Release me." A single voice, male, breathy and sharp, like it had been holding back a scream. It didn't sound like a plea. It sounded like a command. I dropped the recorder. It clattered across the floor, but the words still echoed in my mind. I should have left. Any rational person would have. But something inside me had changed. Curiosity was no longer the right word. I needed to know what was in that well. Who, or what, was speaking to me. That night, the dreams returned. I was no longer in my bed, but standing at the edge of the well. The village burned behind me. I could hear chanting in a language I didn't know. Voices layered over each other, rising in tempo, surrounding me. Something slithered around my ankles, cold and wet. When I looked down, there were hands, gray, twisted hands, reaching up from the mouth of the well, and in the center of the pit, 2 pale eyes opened, fixing themselves on mine. I screamed and woke up to silence, until I turned and saw the scratches on my window. Deep, deliberate gouges dragged across the glass. The window was still locked from the inside. I ran my fingers across the markings. They hadn't been there before. And there was something else. A faint residue, like soot or ash. I backed away, suddenly aware of how quiet the room was. No wind, no birds. Just silence, thick and pressing. I opened my laptop and played the recording one more time, hoping it would sound different in the daylight. But this time, after the first voice, another joined it. A whisper layered beneath the command. Elena. I didn't sleep at all that night. The scratches on my window hadn't faded by morning. If anything, they seemed deeper, darker, as if they had burrowed into the glass overnight. I didn't tell anyone. What could I say that wouldn't sound insane? Instead, I threw myself into research, hoping knowledge would bring clarity. If something truly was inside that well, I had to understand what. I returned to the chapel archive, the only place in Eldermore that hadn't turned cold toward me. The villagers no longer spoke when I passed. Doors shut faster, eyes dropped. Even the innkeeper avoided conversation, sliding my meals into the room with a nod and a hurried retreat. I didn't care. Not anymore. I needed answers. Hours passed as I combed through brittle records, parish notes, family trees, and untranslated fragments of ancient prayer books. Then I found it. A bundle of pages hidden behind a false panel in the back of a cabinet. They were scorched at the edges, ink smeared in places but mostly intact. They weren't written in English, nor Latin, but in an older dialect, one I only partially understood. I translated what I could. The entries were disturbing. They spoke of a time when Eldermore wasn't a village of fearful silence, but a place of worship. Not to God, but to something older, something they called Velruin, a name that wasn't meant to be spoken aloud. They believed it lived beneath the earth and granted power, protection, and prosperity in exchange for offerings. At first, it demanded crops, livestock, but then came the sacrifices. Children. Entire families. The pages grew darker, both in content and tone. There was a shift, from reverence to panic. The god they had fed had grown hungry. Insatiable, it turned on them. What happened next was written in shaky hand, like the author was terrified even as they wrote. The villagers, desperate, sought guidance from an outsider. A monk versed in forbidden rites, one who had studied ancient containment rituals lost to time. Under his direction, they performed a final rite, a sealing. It required the death of every remaining devotee. Their blood, their souls, all offered to create a prison, not for the god itself, but for its voice. The well was its cage, its mouth, its tether to this world. They bound it with blood and language, symbols etched in stone, sealing Velruin's whispers beneath layers of silence. There was a final warning, hastily scrawled in the margins of the last page. If it speaks, do not listen. If it listens, do not answer. If the seal breaks, it will remember every voice it ever touched. I sat back, hands trembling. My recorder, still tucked in my bag, had picked up a voice. And worse, it had said my name. I rushed back to my room, heart hammering. I had to hear it again. I had to know if the voice was real. I played the recording again, this time with headphones, isolating the background noise. And there, after "release me," just beneath the crackle of static, came a second whisper. Different than before. Slower. Deeper. You hear me? Suddenly, the recorder made a high-pitched whine and sparked in my hand. I dropped it instinctively, but not before seeing something leak from its speaker. A black, viscous fluid, thick as oil and reeking of metal and rot. It smeared across the floor, seeping toward my boots. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair, but the fluid evaporated before my eyes, leaving behind nothing but a foul, lingering scent. I didn't sleep. I didn't even sit. I paced the room for hours, whispering translations to myself, clutching the journal like a lifeline. Something had shifted. The voice wasn't just reaching out. It had found me. And now, I was listening. I stopped leaving the room during daylight. The whispers didn't care about time anymore, and neither did I. I kept the curtains drawn tight, the door locked, my journal open. Pages filled faster than I could comprehend. Symbols poured from my pen, not just sketches of the runes from the well, but new ones, unfamiliar, unstudied, untraceable. And I wasn't copying them. I was creating them. Or maybe something else was guiding my hand. The villagers no longer acknowledged me. Even the innkeeper stopped bringing food. I didn't blame them. I must have looked like death, a shell of myself. My skin was pale and dry, my eyes rimmed in red from sleepless nights, and my voice had grown hoarse from speaking to things that never answered. Or rather, never answered aloud. Because I knew something was responding. In my dreams. In the corners of my room. In the movement of shadows that danced just outside my vision. The well was no longer a subject of study. It was the only thing that mattered. I began sleeping beside it. Dragging my sleeping bag into the clearing, I curled up next to the ancient stone rim, lulled by whispers that had grown softer, almost affectionate. It felt like home, warm, welcome. But only when I was near it. When I left, the voices screamed. I tried telling myself this was scientific, that I was documenting the effects of isolation, that the hallucinations were stress-induced. But deep down, I knew better. I wasn't imagining this. Something beneath that well knew me now, and it didn't want me to leave. One night, I awoke to find symbols carved into the stone beside my sleeping bag. They matched the ones I'd been drawing in my journal, but I hadn't etched them. Not consciously. My fingers were raw and bleeding, my nails chipped. I didn't remember doing it. I didn't remember dreaming. But I felt closer to the well than ever before. Like it had moved a little nearer to me in the night. Or I had moved nearer to it. The village elder found me that morning. He hadn't spoken to me since my arrival. But that day he stood at the tree line, staring at me with a look that was equal parts sorrow and fear. He didn't step into the clearing. He just called out, voice shaking. "There's a prophecy," he said, "one we hoped would never come to pass. When the listener obeys, the seal shall break." I stared at him. My hands were shaking, dirt-caked and trembling. "What does it want?" I asked. He looked at me like he pitied me. It doesn't want. It waits. And once you answer, it's no longer waiting. I didn't respond. I turned back to the well, feeling a strange pulse in the stone beneath my hand, like a heartbeat, like breath. I heard the whispers again that night, closer now, louder, no longer needing the cover of night to reach me. They said things I couldn't repeat, things that felt ancient and raw and true, promises, bargains, warnings, and among them, always the same phrase, "You know me." I returned to my journal to clear my mind, but when I flipped to a blank page, I froze. Pages were filled with writing I didn't remember putting there. Entire passages scrawled in a sharp, spindly hand I didn't recognize, written in a language I had never studied, but somehow understood. I translated one line out loud without meaning to. The room went cold, my breath visible. The mirror on the far wall cracked down the center. My recorder hissed to life on its own. Something was coming, and I had already invited it in. The storm came without warning. Eldermore hadn't seen thunder or lightning in decades, or so the villagers claimed. But that night, the sky tore open. I remember sitting at the edge of my bed, journal open in my lap, when the first rumble cracked through the silence. The wind howled as if the forest itself were groaning. My window pane shook with each gust, and the clouds churned like something alive was trying to break through. The whispers had grown unbearable. They no longer waited for nightfall or solitude. They were with me now, always, filling the corners of every thought, guiding my hand, even as I resisted. They weren't begging anymore. They were commanding. Now. I didn't remember standing. I didn't remember dressing or grabbing my boots or stepping out into the rain. One moment, I was inside. The next, I was walking through the village as lightning forked through the sky above me, painting the mist in electric flashes. The streets were empty, doors barred, curtains drawn. The entire village knew something was happening. They just didn't dare stop it. The path to the well seemed shorter this time. The woods parted around me as if they had memorized my steps. The trees groaned and twisted under the force of the wind, and the rain fell in thick, heavy sheets, but none of it touched me. I moved like I was in a dream, or under a spell. I didn't feel cold. I didn't feel anything. The clearing appeared, and there it was. The well, waiting. It pulsed faintly in the dark, the stones glowing with an unnatural crimson hue, as if fire burned just beneath its surface. The symbols I had once studied were no longer still. They moved. They shifted, rearranging themselves in ways I couldn't follow. I approached, breath shallow, heart silent, and as I stepped forward, the ground trembled. Now. Release. Now. The voices screamed from every direction and from none at all. From the trees, from the sky, from inside me. I stumbled to the edge of the well, the pull stronger than ever before, the air around it thick and humming with energy. My hair stood on end, my skin prickled. Lightning struck a tree just yards behind me, setting it ablaze, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't. I climbed onto the well's edge. The stones burned beneath my hands, but I didn't feel pain, only peace. For the first time in weeks, the chaos inside me grew still. The whispers weren't urging anymore. They were welcoming, calling me home. The sky exploded again with light, and in that final flash, I looked down into the abyss. It no longer looked like a pit. It looked like an eye, and it was open. I don't remember jumping. I only remember falling. And silence. The scream came at first light. It cut through the fog like a blade, waking the entire village from a collective, uneasy sleep. It wasn't human, not entirely. It carried something else with it. Anguish, terror, and something ancient that didn't belong in this world. The sound echoed through the hills and faded into silence, leaving a kind of emptiness behind that the villagers would later swear they could feel more than hear. They didn't need to ask where it had come from. The well had claimed someone again. A small group of brave, or perhaps desperate, villagers gathered their courage and ventured into the woods. The storm had passed, But its damage was evident. Trees lay split and smoldering. The earth was scorched in strange circular patterns, as if something had risen from beneath. And when they reached the clearing, they found it. The well was no longer silent. Thick, black liquid oozed over its rim, spilling onto the ground like blood from an open wound. It hissed against the soil, emitting a sulfurous stench that made the men gag. The runes along the stones had changed again, twisted and warped, some glowing faintly even in daylight. Elena was gone. Her tent stood untouched nearby, zipped closed and dry despite the storm. Inside were her notes, her journal, her equipment, everything perfectly in place. There was no sign of struggle, no trail leading away. Her final entry was left open on the last page, the ink smeared but readable. The door is open. I saw it, and it saw me. They sealed the well that same evening. Cement trucks were brought in from the nearest town. Priests, despite their uncertainty about what they were even facing, blessed the area with trembling hands. No one spoke as the final layer of concrete was poured, and no one stayed to watch it dry. Weeks passed. Then came the silence. Animals stopped entering the woods. The birds, once skittish but ever present, vanished. Livestock were found mutilated at the edge of the forest, eyes wide and jaws broken as if caught mid-scream. Villagers reported waking in the night to distant chanting, to whispers beneath their floorboards, to dreams they couldn't escape. One child drew a picture in school, a stone circle, a woman with no face, and two shadowy figures standing in the well's mouth. The teacher asked who they were. The child replied, "The ones who talk now." The villagers pleaded for help. The government sent surveyors who found nothing. Paranormal investigators stayed for a night and left pale and shaken. No one stayed long. Eventually, a plaque was placed over the concrete. "Do not disturb. Danger. Unstable ground." It was a lie, but it was better than the truth. And now, on quiet nights, when the wind dies and the fog rolls thick over Eldermoor, the villagers listen. Not because they want to, but because they can't not hear it. The whispering. Two voices, one pleading, one answering.